So welcome back to Labels and Legacies, Anticipating Adjustments with Atif and some very special guests. This is a series of monthly free panel sessions from Diversity and Ability, where our CEO, Atif Choudhury, will be joined by expert speakers. And together they'll dive into a thought-provoking discussion on how adjustments are seen and put into practice and how we can maybe rethink them too. And today we're discussing adjustments passports. Now, a few years ago, that wasn't a term that inspired a lot of hope in me. I know it's the same for a lot of disabled people. It conjured up images of really long and inaccessible PDFs where you are asked to share very personal details in order to access basic adjustments like extra time for my exams at university. But now organizations that are led by lived experience of disability and neurodiversity, like Diversity and Ability and Genius Within, are at the forefront of passport conversations. So with that in mind, can things change? Let's find out. So I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists for today. Firstly, as always, Atif is our chair. Atif Choudhury is a community advocate challenging perceptions of disability, neurodiversity, homelessness, and more through his work as co-founder and CEO of Diversity and Ability, or DNA. Atif's work aims to reduce social, educational, and digital exclusion among disabled, neurodiverse, and homeless individuals. Atif has supported over 100,000 people and over 200 organizations through DNA's work. He was named a top community advocate in the Disability Power 100 of 2023 and now sits on the judging panel for the Power 100. Atif's own lived experience has committed him to creating a world where psychological safety is taken seriously, lived experience is centered, and disabling barriers are dismantled. He delivers workshops and talks at events and conferences across the globe, sharing the urgency of establishing intersectionally inclusive environments, and is recognized as a change maker in mental health and global disability justice. As well as DNA, Atif also co-founded Zaytoun CIT, a fair trade foods company supporting families and farmers in Palestine. He's also an advisor to the World Health Organization Rapid Assistive Technologies Board and a trustee for Disability Rights UK. And today we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our panelist who joins us, Dr. Nancy Doyle. Dr. Nancy Doyle is the founder and chief science officer of Genius Within CIC, an international B Corp and nonprofit. Genius Within provides coaching, assessment, training, HR consultancy, and scalable digital services to thousands of businesses each year. Nancy has worked in disability inclusion since the late 1990s and is a chartered occupational and coaching psychologist, registered with both the British Psychological Society and the American Psychological Association. Nancy is also the co-founder of the Centre for Neurodiversity at Work at the University of London. Nancy is a Forbes columnist and BBC documentary maker known for her work on neurodiversity inclusion globally. She provides thought, leadership, expert reference, talks and workshops for the United Nations, for universities such as Imperial, Cambridge, Oxford and Stanford, the UK government and international companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Veolia and Orange. And finally, we're Diversity and Ability. We're an award-winning social enterprise led by and for disabled people. We advocate for social change, equity and inclusion on the macro and micro scale, delivering training and consultancy on intersectional disability inclusion across the globe. Right, I'm going to hand over to Atif now to begin our discussion, and I can't wait to hear from you both.
Thank you, Ellie. And as ever, just thank you everyone for joining us wherever you are in the world. And if you're listening live or you're joining us later on, we're always excited, and we would love to hear more from you folks as well as to how these conversations show up for you. You know, did they bring a new sense of perspectives on barriers? Do they make you want to reinforce labels? Is it a bit of both? You know, that's what the space is here for, really. So I will just sort of gently warm up as well. And I'm really excited to have Nancy join us today as well. And our kind of, it's exciting to know our work. Well, I suppose it's the same for Nancy as it is for me. How long have you been doing it? Well, your whole life, really. I mean, 50 years, right? You know, in my case. And Nancy's, we're very similar. And, you know, DNA and Genius Within, which is amazing work, really amazing. They both started at the same time. So it's a real excitement to think those shared journeys and parallels and the justice that's attached to, you know, those values. So this is a great session really to unpack that. And I think we're going to do a really good job of doing that. But you guys, let us know when you're watching it. So I'm going to start asking you questions really with Nancy about, and the main theme of this session on labels and legacies is around adjustments, and passports themselves. They are coming. There's an opportunity to make them really good. But like any crossroads, there's an opportunity for them to be potentially quite awful. So that is what we're going to discuss. And I think we can do that really well. And I think we're going to do that with the justice it deserves. So I'm going to ask some questions to Nancy, and then we'll just explore it and tease it out to all of you listening. And please do use the chat in any way you want. I mean, obviously be kind, but use words that say, how do you, passports, what do they mean to you? Okay. So my first question to Nancy is, what were your first past experiences with adjustment passports? Did it feel like a positive or negative thing for you coming across?
So I've got two stories for this. And the first story is about the first time I created one, as it were. And, this is back in the myths of time. This wasn't an electronic thing. This was, part of a workplace needs assessment. And I had gone to see an autistic man who was working in IT in a non-IT company. So it was a retail company, but he was in IT. He had his 9th manager in 10 years.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And they were not getting along. And the manager was not an IT specialist, and they just weren't understanding each other at all. So the way I do workplace needs assessments is I speak to the individual, and then I speak to the manager, and then I have a little formulation of what might work, and then I bring them back in and we negotiate and get it so that all parties agree by the time I leave. So I'm talking to the manager, and I asked him the question, what would your employee need to be able to do that he can't currently do that would make this work out really well for you? And he said, I just need him to play the game. And I had a little laugh, and I thought to myself, gosh, I hope that's not what you say to him, because he's quite a literal interpreting autistic man, and he's going to wonder why you want him to play games at work. And so I sort of said that as a little joke, and the manager looked a bit stunned. He said, well, I mean, it's obvious what it means, isn't it? You have to play the game. You have to join in. It means playing the game. And I realized that was exactly what he was saying to his employee. So I sort of pushed him. I said, right, what do you mean by play the game? He said, well, I want him to be a bit more proactive, a little bit less reactive. I'm like, still, I don't know what you mean. Let's try again. Oh, and he needs to be more prepared. I'm like, still. And eventually I got this guy to explain that what he needed, they had a weekly meeting, and he needed his employee to turn up every week with one A4 piece of paper with a bullet point list of things he'd done last week, and another A4 paper with a bullet point list of things he was planning to do that week. And that was it. That was all he needed from him. And because they hadn't been able to communicate across those things, their relationship had spiraled out of control. So then I'm thinking to myself, what's the adjustment here? What's the intervention? So what I arranged was some coaching for the employee, because the intervention isn't for the manager necessarily to change his behavior, because the likelihood is this guy's going to have another manager in a year's time, right? Mm-hmm. The intervention is for the employee to know how to ask those questions to get somebody from vague, ambiguous, an analogy language into concrete, practical tasks that he can listen to. But the workplace needs assessment, the adjustment that the employer has to make is it has to be okay for him to ask those questions. So it needs to be somewhere on his HR file that when a new manager starts with him, he's got a list, or she's got a list of what this person needs. And top of that list needs to be, this employee needs to ask questions and might want to ask a few more questions than you're used to in order to understand the specifics of the task you're instructing them to do. They like a lot of detail, and they will need to check all the details before they can do the instruction. And that has to be okay. So that was, I think, the prototype idea, many years ago that made me think this was going to work, because it's about the transition of the information, isn't it, that employee can take with them, and they don't have to go through the whole process from start to finish again, and have those weeks or months where they're not doing their best work because they're waiting for some changes. So I think that's my positive experience, and I think that's fundamentally what we're trying to do.
Great. Lovely to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on a couple of things, and it's worth folks listening to this, that most of the adjustments, and we have a passport here, which we'll talk about another day, but most adjustments we find from the data and from the findings is that they're free. This is a really good example
Absolutely.
of one where, and they're quite low cost. The work that's been done on the research is roughly about £75 an adjustment. The difference between mental health loss, retention of staff, fatigue, and even managers feeling deflated is surely worth addressing, but regardless of the cost itself. But it shocks people as to how cheap it is when you can just have a very human-centered response. That was a great one, Nancy.
Yeah. And I think the irony of that as well is that the process of assessment is usually more expensive than the recommendations.
Yeah.
And so, we have this idea that we're running a system of scarcity, that there aren't enough resources to go around when it comes to disability inclusion. And we have to compete for scarce resources in schools, in workplaces, in society. But actually, when so much of what is needed is free and predictable, not just free, but perfectly predictable. I mean, I've done probably thousands of workplace needs assessments in the last 20 plus years. And what people need doesn't change. They need support with time management, organization, communication, concentration. If they're neurodivergent, if they have acquired brain injury related also to mental health, these things, we think of those things as difficult because they're non-visible, but actually what people need is very predictable, and it happens the same way over and over again, which is where I think, your question as well was is it a positive or a negative thing? For me, it's only a negative. There's two ways it can be a negative thing. One is when, and I have seen this happen before, I've seen ERGs where they started comparing their disability passports and then getting into a grump about who had what. So they were literally running the politics of scarcity, and they weren't thinking about how those adjustments had been triangulated between them, their job, the requirements of their job, the health and safety risks associated with their job, their context. They were just doing a straight compare. So that can be negative. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. But then the other thing is when we're doing this one person at a time and we're failing to see what's the bigger picture here. We could learn from these things. When we see what happens over and over again, we can just start putting that stuff in as standard. And that then takes a layer of need out of the system. And that's what I've been trying to do for the last couple of years, is go, how do we aggregate this data? How do we have a kind of heat map of who needs what around the company? And that's what I've built into the Genius Finder, because I think prevention is better than cure. If we can see where the needs are going to come from, we can prevent them before they become a crisis. Because once they're a crisis, everybody. Managers grumpy, employees grumpy, team members are grumpy, people are spending Sunday worried about Monday, they're waking up at 4 a.m. You've got all of that. And it just feels like such an unnecessary waste of human potential. So that's I think we haven't quite seen the full bounty of what this process can bring us. And that's the negative for me. We've got to see it through.
Great. Thank you. So I guess my next question is, how do passports fit into intersectional realities?
I mean, well, the short answer is disclosure, isn't it? The intersectional reality of disability is that those who put their hand up and ask for help, those who ask for a disability passport, are they feeling anxious about belonging, already feeling stigmatized for other parts of their identity that they have no control over. So, when we make when we put all the support behind the gatekeeping of disclosure and diagnosis, we create an intersectional imbalance and intersecting identities around sexuality, transgender, race, ethnicity, poverty, gender. All of those things become blockers for people to get through. I mean, it's not exclusive. It's not that everybody that has a minoritized aspect of themselves in their workplace won't put their hand up, but it becomes less likely. And I think that's the other reason for starting to do this electronically, where we can do it anonymously, where people can get some support, at least the first layer of support, without having to go through disclosure as a barrier. I think that for me it's an intersectional reality. We wouldn't want it to be that way. It would be much better if everybody could freely discuss and feel transparent. But the reality is that isn't the case in British businesses and in British social structures right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Often it's said, we're on a journey, and I've always felt, yes, that's true. But it is sort of demotivating when people in power say we're on a journey, when you just want needs to be met and welcome. Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess this really touches on, and you've rightly said it, there are intersectional realities that make it harder for people to share differences. And I say so very much, and I think we're on the same place on this for sure, that so much about passports will be about sharing and not disclosures, as you've rightly said. Disclosure, as we often say here, is job protection, but job protection is mental health loss. Where sharing is about saying, well, actually, I'm safe here to tell a story. Mm-hmm. Do that, I'm sharing something that informs practice. It widens my participation, but it also widens yours, and such and such. This is absolutely right. So I guess we're touching on the goals here, that in a way, this isn't really a conversation about disabled people or even neurodiverse or neurodivergent people. This is a conversation about people, so that's, and ultimately, because if we take that, and I do want to stress it, the joy of the social model, that we can see barriers and we all face them collectively. I have a question, is every individual having a passport a goal? Maybe. But I think for those watching and listening is that maybe that's not the goal. That social change is the real goal. Mm. And if I explore that with you to see a future of disability justice, which is about barriers rather than reasonable adjustments, that in itself is a court of law that dictates what is reasonable or not. It's not a person that gets to do it. It's usually a judge. Quite exhausting in itself. So, so what does the future of that look like for you if it wasn't about neurodiversity or disability alone, but rather just about all of us?
Well, for me, it's about, this is the future of work. I think our neurodivergent and disabled communities are doing the work through passports of educating businesses as to how they can create personalized work environments that enable people to thrive. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. We hear all the time this, fabled future of work. There's the World Economic Forum's famous report, skills for the 21st century, creativity, innovation, rah, rah, rah. But what does that actually look like? What will we be doing that we're not doing now? How do we, thinking about my chap who was working in IT and retail, how do we take that from the future of work or play the game into, right, what we need is 2 A4 pieces of paper. But, we don't have the practical operational knowledge of what that future of work looks like. But the trend in the 21st century is personalization, not standardization. So standardization was the absolute feature of the Industrial Revolution. We needed human being automatons to do the same thing over and over again. We needed everyone to be literate, numerate, able to use fine motor control, able to sit still for hours at a time in increasingly noisy, busy, smelly, dirty environments. But now we don't need that. We don't need offices in the same way because we don't have file ledgers in files. They're all electronic, so we can be anywhere. So we've got these big changes in the technological age. And we're looking at, medicine is becoming personalized. We've realized in medicine that if you prescribe everybody the same dose of the drug that works for most people, then there's a lot of people who are not going to get well that way. And so we've learned that we need to personalize it. We have personalized media, and that's not necessarily a good thing, and I think we'll come back to that. But the idea of personalization rather than standardization is the theme, isn't it? So how do you personalize a workplace? How do you put it? What do you need to be able to flex? You need to be able to flex sensory input. You need to be able to flex around hours, around commuting, around the different styles of technology. Some people like to use mind mapping software to organize their stuff. Other people like Kanban boards. Other people like Gantt charts. Other people like to-do lists. How can we create a system where people can do it in a way that works for them, and then they are able to work at their best? So I think if we listen to neurodivergent and disabled people, if we listen to what is coming up in this over and over again style, we just create these things as standard, and we are also creating the ability for people who aren't necessarily disabled but have preferences and styles to have more flexibility around the way that they work. And I think that's a great thing. I don't know if you've come across Dr. Ludmila Praslova's book, The Canary Code. Have you seen that?
Yeah. Okay.
She is an American occupational psychologist like me, and she's autistic, and she writes for Harvard Business Review and Forbes as well. And she's written this amazing book called The Canary Code, and it's about neuro-inclusive workplaces. And in it, she's using a metaphor of the canary in the mine shaft.
Yeah,
and what she's basically saying is the neurodivergent people, we start to lose performance first when things are too noisy, too busy, too smelly, too disorganized, rah, rah, rah. But we're just doing it first. It will affect everybody else as well. So if you can create a workplace where the canaries feel safe, feel secure, feel able to work, bring their best selves, be their creative potential. If you create a workplace for us, you will make everybody's life better. And I would really recommend that book if you haven't read it.
I love it. I love it. Yeah,
very good.
It's often said here that those that are on the front line of barriers, whether they hide them or not, whether they can mask them or not be able to, are predicting the future. They're showing us what participation looks like, and they're showing us what planning looks like. Yeah. No, actually, I agree very much with sentiments of the Industrial Revolution as well. I'm still nervous about how we look at this and through class struggle. But I do agree the Industrial Revolution was perhaps one of the largest mass disabling events of the world, in our history.
Yeah.
Of how we expected human beings to be. And the legacy of that, hasn't changed in 100 years, right? Working memory, literacy skills.
Yeah.
Fine motor skills is how we decide children's value.
Totally. Yeah. Our schools are actually moving slower towards this new reality than our workplaces. And as a result, our schools are no longer training children for what they're going to experience in a workplace. I've had rows with Senkos, as you can imagine, or any of my friends that have neurodivergent kids. I kind of end up having some sort of joint Senko meeting at some point, and I can just hear them, oh no, she's brought that woman again, that woman. So I am that woman in a few local schools. But I do remember once talking to a Senko about a 14-year-old autistic boy who was struggling with his handwriting, also dyspraxic, in the bottom 10% of the population for fine motor control. And she said, well, I can see that sometimes he finds writing difficult and sometimes he's just being defiant. And I thought, okay, find me a 14-year-old boy who isn't being defiant. Come on, let's start there. And then I said to her, to be honest, I'm really confused because in a workplace, we wouldn't be asking him to handwrite.
Yeah.
In any workplace that I've worked in the last 15 years, someone with that much difficulty with handwriting would have a tablet, a voice recorder, drag and dictate. Yeah. At very least, they'd be given the opportunity to type instead of write to see if that's easier. And she said, oh, well, we do have that equipment, but he's never asked to use it.
Yeah, it's a lack of anticipatory duties.
Totally. And then we had another conversation about his tie, because he had sensory issues and he wanted to wear his tie loose. And she said, well, what will happen if he has a high-powered job one day and needs to wear a tie? Yeah. And I just thought, love, when was the last time you were in the real world? People don't wear ties anymore. Yeah. You know, Mark Zuckerberg, Christine Lagarde. I can think of lots of high-powered people not wearing ties, you know. So it just, that stuff still makes me quite cross, actually. There's a reason I don't work in education, and it's because I wouldn't be able to regulate my emotions in order to do my work.
No, that's great. Well, what we're touching on here is so fundamentally important. It's an attitudinal thing, right? Ultimately, yes. That some of the biggest barriers we're here to talk about aren't whether we can access labels or not, but that is a discussion and a diagnosis in itself, and how healing it can be for so many in need of one, and whether they are fit for purpose for those who are coming from international realities and backgrounds and migration, but what underpins this conversation is attitudes, right? It's whether we feel like we can even have this conversation and be part of it, whether we're safe. I think the workplace, I'm going to touch on your great work that you guys have been doing on the report on the workplace itself. I have sort of challenges because I think so much in the workplace we understand it to be offices, and I still feel there's some depth of work, and I hope a real courage in that understanding. My father worked on a factory line, and he turned down promotions because he was quite frightened that he worked at Ford, but he was quite frightened that they would see that he doesn't write. And in that sense, growing up as kids, I would look back and think, what person turns down a promotion? He was very good at what he did on that, in terms of quality control for production lines, but he was almost like a bird in the hand is better than the risk, because if you are promoted and they see. And I think this is a kind of paralysis that is far bigger outside offices than people realize. And it's deeply impacted on people who are facing these barriers around hidden differences in neurodiversity itself. So coming from different backgrounds that aren't necessarily given the generosity to be in that space, to say, what is it for you when you're not in the workplace? Or what is it for you from an intersectional space? And such and such. I think that's the growth ahead of us, as to whether we can grow to that question is what I think Nancy and what Genius has done, and others, so DNA and Lexic and others have really worked hard to sort of build upon for the next generation to hopefully smash it, But I also think we do. So I like to think we move in progressive steps, in linear journeys, but that's not always the case. And I think the report has sort of said that, which is a little bit sad, right? I think I'm going to ask you a question around it and maybe explore. But according to the report and the research you guys did on neurodiversity and business report, neurodiverse employees are feeling less supported in 2024 than in 2023. Yes. That's a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a backlash.
Right.
That's what I think we're seeing specifically in neurodiversity. I think we're seeing a backlash. There were lots of little bits in that report where you could see the struggle. So another thing we did, so in 2023, we asked neurodivergent people what they thought their strengths and their challenges were in the workplace. We asked their managers what they thought their strengths and challenges were in the workplace. And what we noticed in 2023 is a high level of agreement between managers and staff as to what those strengths and challenges were, which we were quite encouraged by. But in 2024, we asked colleagues as well. So we asked neurotypical colleagues, and that's where we found the big differences. So, for example, neurodivergent people were citing one of their strengths as resilience and tenacity, and their colleagues did not see the same. They did not see that as a neurodivergent strength, but they also did not see the challenge of working memory. So neurodivergent people are saying working memory, i.e., your concentration span, the amount you can hold at any one time when you're thinking things through. They rated that as a big challenge, and their colleagues do not see that big challenge. So I think this for me is a representation of the double empathy problem. That the trope that neurodivergent people don't have empathy, specifically autistic people, lack empathy because the way autistic people communicate is misinterpreted by neurotypical people as being lacking in empathy. But actually, the real problem is that neurotypical people aren't having empathy for the autistic people who are communicating in a different way. And I think that's this in action. So what we've seen is this sense that colleagues don't understand what the problems are. And so colleagues think that neurodivergent employees are making a fuss, being too sensitive, not kind of being resilient and kind of coping. And as a result, there's friction and conflict, which the managers are now trying to manage, and the employees are picking that up. I have to say, in both years, employees were very, very positive about their direct line managers. So they feel supported by their line managers, but not necessarily by the team or the business as a whole. So I think the other conclusion that we've drawn from this is that managers are doing a lot of heavy lifting, and managers are not always neurotypical themselves. They are not always non-disabled themselves. They have other lives. Managers are doing a lot of heavy lifting with very little support. And I think we should be really targeting how can we support managers to do their jobs well, and to know what to do and how to do it. Yeah,
it's a really, really important space to have. I mean, often a culture of any organization isn't so much what the CEO says. In fact, it's not at all. I think it lives and dies with the line manager.
Yeah, it does.
Line manager will have more impact on your mental health well-being than any therapist or doctor. But at the same time, it's so nice to hear this in the sense of, and I fully agree. I think there are a lot of folks who are struggling to say, look, we're not psychic, and we're not. And the worst thing about it is somehow we're being expected to be. Whereas I think it is totally okay to say we don't know this. We have inherited seismic issues, they're structural issues, but we want to get it right. But we want to know that we have the resources to get it right. And as we've touched on already, some of those resources aren't expensive at all. But it's walking each other home in this, right? So I guess it brings me back to passports in its own way.
Totally. It totally leads back to passports. This is why we're both so into passports.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think when I think about the report and attitudes and shifts as well, I said I won't overly plug it, but I think the idea of a digital passport is actually the way forward. Being able to control it. What I share with Nancy is what I can give, and I can say, "Here's my passport for lunch," because that's all you need to have. We're just having lunch. I'm good with peanuts. Whatever. Here's a passport for long term. Here's a passport that maybe I've got a manager who I don't want them to see the passport. But I need the HR director to see it. I can share that, and I can see where it's going.
Totally. You've stumbled on a really interesting point there, actually, Atif. So when I first started Genius Within, one of the reasons I started the company actually is because I was really grumpy about what was happening to diagnostic reports. So I was doing diagnostic reports in various places, and they were being sent to the employer, not the employee.
Okay.
And that was the occupational health standard. If I do a diagnostic report, I send that to the HR director that commissioned the report, not to the person it's written about. And I was absolutely, I couldn't, well, for starters, I didn't do it. So I used to break the rules all the time. I used to make people give me their email addresses and send it to them as a draft so that we could edit it together, But I was also fairly sure that it wasn't in line with professional practice standards, because it's medical grade data. It's personal. And although it's normal in healthcare for professionals to share reports around with each other, but also in healthcare, all the professionals are registered professionals. And they've all signed up to agreements around ethics and practice around what you do with that information and how you treat people's personal information with care and consideration. But HR managers haven't. And I know lots of them are very respectable people who would do the right thing. but there's nothing to stop them doing the wrong thing. There's no regulatory framework around how they process that data or interpret that data, or the meaning they make from that data, and the decisions that they make as a result of that data. So having the data and the information in the hands of the individual to which it pertains, I think is an absolute fundamental. And yeah, that was one of my drivers for setting up Genius Within, was to have a company where we didn't do that. Oh, and you know, the occupational health companies used to get really grumpy with me, but I used to say, listen, any psychologist who is doing that for you is flouting our professional practice guidelines, which says that the end user is always the person you have to prioritize, not the bill payer. It's really clear. It's in black and white, you know, and I've won that battle eventually, I think.
Brilliant. No, I share that as well. Sometimes you're sitting there as the consultant, for example, commissioned by the organization, but you've got to give, and you have to have the courage to just give potentially bad news, and then you can be spat out as a consultant. Or
totally. I mean, sometimes people withdraw their consent for their reports to be shared, or you know, we at Genius Within, we do a summary report with really basic information that can be shared, and sometimes people still withdraw their consent for that to be shared, and the employers get really grumpy, and I'm just like, I'm really sorry, but what do you want me to do? You know, they've withdrawn their consent. How you respond to that as an employer is up to you, but it is not my job to override their wishes. If their consent is withdrawn, that is it. You are not getting the report. I cannot share what happened in that assessment with you. End of.
Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks to the famous adage, nothing about us without us, and those things too. And so it really speaks to the psychological well-being and safety of. We have got to keep pushing this conversation to a point where people say, yeah, actually, look, I'm filling out this data, or I'm sharing this vulnerability. I'm also doing it to strengthen your process, honor me back, and I think that's not a hard thing to ask. Okay. So I guess the question I have here is a couple ones, is that, so in that context of ensuring neurodiversity can be seen as a strength and not a struggle, because in truth, I don't have a either or on this, So learning isolation is a term that I like to use for folks who we don't necessarily have a diagnosis. And it's not all good. From my own experience as a youngster or many moons ago, I didn't go, I love my superpower. Far from it. I won't elaborate on that, but it's far from it. So we go from this idea of sometimes feeling like we're this clap-tap banger that can't pass an MOT, and one day and the next day you're a Lamborghini. And somehow really it's just about everyday belonging, just safety on that motorway, just to go at your pace and enjoy the ride, but we're going from one to another. So I guess, how do we move the conversation on neurodiversity, not just to see it as a strength or a struggle, but it's just, again, it's everyday belonging?
I think we have to reduce some of the fear. And we have to get rid of this scarcity model. The scarcity model is what's doing everybody's heads in. That's why we've got a backlash. And I think people have a sense of overwhelm in businesses. People are like, oh my goodness, there are so many people. I don't know how to handle this. So we've got to take it out of the scarcity model. We've got to educate people as to how cheap and easy it is to make adjustments. But I also think we need to, it's not just about putting the data in the hands of the person to which it pertains. It's also putting the agency back into the hands of the person to which it pertains. There's lots about the process of being diagnosed clinically that is very disempowering. You have to wait for an expert to come and talk to you. They do loads of complicated things for a few hours, and then they write a report. Most people write reports that can't be read or understood easily by the person they're being written about, which again, we don't do that at Genius Within. We use Flesch-Kincaid readability statistics to make sure that they are readable and understandable. We put diagrams in them and, stuff. But the majority of time, what's happening is, the message, the overriding message is, I need someone to help me. I need expensive expertise. What's wrong with me? I'm too stupid to understand. I can't understand what this is all about. And now I need more people to come and tell me what to do next. And And I think that whole process leaves people very vulnerable. And so, as someone who's been a coach for over 20 years, the thing I love the most about coaching is moving the agency back to the person that I'm working with. Yeah. So when I turn up as a coach, they're expecting me to be the next expert that comes and tells them what to do. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to work with them and develop that self-awareness and develop that ability for them to work out what they need to do next, for them to pattern what are the environments that suit me, what is my rhythm of being an old clapped out banger versus being a Lamborghini. Does it have a circadian rhythm? Does it flow over the space of a few months? Is it related to the type of projects I've got on the go? Is it related to how much sleep I've got? How can I develop that awareness of myself and then start to move things into my circle of control that I can actually change and work on? And that's an empowering process. And that's what I think a passport should be the gateway to. It's not a list of demands that you take to your boss, that your boss has to tick off. A passport should be based on your iterative knowledge of yourself and how you work at your best. It should be orientated around your performance and your potential. When we play this game of disabled and neurodivergent people needing expensive experts to help us, we are infantilizing disabled and neurodivergent people. Where's our ambition?
Yeah.
Where is our ambition for people? What we want is for people to thrive, not just to be helped and to have, a list of things that mean that they don't get to fully find out what they can do for themselves and how they can progress. So I think that switch of agency is really important in this process. It's why we move further and further away from diagnosis. If someone calls up Genius Within and says, I've got this amount of money, what shall I do with it? I never say diagnosis. It's always coaching. That's where we start, and maybe some sort of workplace needs assessment, but actually Genius Finder to look at where your strengths and challenges are, Genius Finder to make some recommendations, and then coaching, because I want individuals to feel that they have the capability to know what they need, how to communicate about it, how to get it in place, and how to show that those things then lead to outstanding work, or totally nailing the work and being competent and meeting targets, and that's why it's worth it.
Great. No, I love it. Absolutely. Of course I will do. Yeah. Look, and folks, check out Genius Finder. Everyone listening, go see it. This is it, right? And I think this is really touching on a couple of things. I'm conscious of time, but I'll try and weave it in. Is that sometimes we've got an illusion that we're talking about the same thing, that we share. It's fair to say we don't have a consensus on neurodiversity necessarily, and that's okay. I actually love that. I know that there are times I've got to think about how it could be said, and how it lands, rather than not just how it's said, but how do we understand neurodiversity? Because it's a moving discussion, and that's and it's full of power and agency for some, and full of fear and disorders. Depending on what social setting you're in.
Completely.
Passports for me bring the attention back into being that this is on my terms. If it's a good passport, if there's a label only passport that says, tell us you've got ADHD, dyslexia, autism, etc., as if we're deciding this is what autism is for everybody. This is what
exactly, and it's not. This is the thing. The labels do not predict what you need. No. Knowing someone's dyslexic doesn't necessarily mean that they definitely need read and write and drag and dictate.
Absolutely.
Knowing that someone's an ADHD doesn't mean that they necessarily need flexible working hours. It does. The labels don't predict, and so therefore, let's keep them out of the conversation. They're personal. They're a personal journey that an individual goes on. They have no business being discussed in a place.
Brilliant. No, this is why it's called Labels and Legacies. Absolutely. And look, for any ambiguity, I'm going to stress labels can be deeply liberating. This is not a podcast that's anti-label.
No.
But what we're saying is it tells us something about something. but it doesn't necessarily tell us everything about what we have to understand. And the challenge is often we have this illusion that the label tells us everything, and
it doesn't. They have no predictive validity, and that's,
for sure. So I'm going to ask a couple questions, and one is, if you were able to sort of succinctly say it, and I know that's not going to be easy because of the passion, and I wouldn't be able to succinctly say it for sure, but what does neurodiversity mean to you?
To me personally, being neurodivergent has enabled me, being diagnosed as neurodivergent has enabled me to forgive myself and to accept myself. It means that I don't chastise myself for the things that I can't do. And instead of trying to do the things that I can't do and failing, I create strategies and scaffolds around me that make it easier and focus on the things I can do. So that's what it means to me personally. What it means to me professionally is in the broad sense, the idea that the human race is neurodiverse, and that we have this complex weave of different types of human being and different types of thinking that are uniquely complementary, and that allows us to do more together than we would be able to do on our own.
Yeah, brilliantly, beautifully said. I really want to say thank you as well for the depth of that as well, and the personal space. Like I always say to folks, and this is never easy. You have to visit a childhood that wasn't always kind, and you have to recognize that some of that lack of kindness, yes, they were from our schooling at times, or even perhaps parenting, but often even from ourselves. And that self-esteem can really be hard to visit. I actually think, I think that neurodiversity for me is precisely that, the joy of human experience, the debt that we owe to that experience when we don't see, and how we rebalance that debt by saying we're looking for it, we're going to come and find it. You can't hide it if we look for it well, but we promise you when we look for it, we're going to look for it with love.
Lovely.
So my last question really is down to this, and is to ask you this question, which is, in all of these things, the work that we've done, the fight, the changes we're seeing in the 15, 16 years we've been doing it, but I guess the hopes and the wishes that we had as children, and the children we're raising. What keeps you hopeful in the work that we're doing now and maybe in the future?
What keeps me hopeful? I spent a lot of last week in despair. I am a joint UK-US national. I and my children vote in US elections. Sadly, we're registered in Vermont and not a swing state. But it's a culture and a country that I relate to. And I found it very hard over the last 8 years to see what that country's been going through. But even, prior to that, I think what keeps me hopeful is history, actually. And, when events like last week happened, I can't listen to political podcasts for a while. I have to go somewhere else. So I go to history. And if you listen to historical podcasts, we've been in this sort of battle for quite some time: justice versus hierarchy, equity versus oppression. These things, this is the battle that is as old as the dawn of time. It's not going to stop anytime soon. What's that lovely phrase from the Talmud that I always say? Do not be burdened by the enormity of the world's grief. Walk humbly now, do justly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And I think that, we can draw into history. I was living in America in 2016. I was shocked at what happened. I immediately joined my local Black Lives Matter chapter and started working through the civil rights movement, learning from people who've done this sort of thing before. And I think if you look through human history, there are so many amazing people and so many amazing stories of ways human beings have become more collaborative and supportive of each other. And I had the loveliest thing pop up on my Instagram this morning. And it was from a guy called Van Jones, who is he's an American TV presenter. And he had this post, and it was, he said, you need to love your neighbors who voted for Trump. And then he said, yes, I know, but you need to love them. And you need to love them because they are not seeing and hearing what you are seeing and hearing. What is on their social media feed is a different story to the one that is on your social media feed. Where you are hearing happy music, they are hearing sad music. Where you are hearing sad music, they are hearing happy music. And if we lose contact with each other, that will be more damaging than anything else. So we have to stay in contact. And I thought it was a really succinct, then he went on to say, did you think that you weren't in a bubble? Did you think that social media was tricking all those people over there, but not you? Did you? Because that's not true. You are in a bubble, and I thought, and I think I see that what I'm seeing at the moment is people really starting to realize that. People are really starting to realize the power of mind control that is being exerted over us in terms of social media. And I think when we break that lock, a lot of things are going to change very quickly. And I don't think it's going to be long until we do it. And I think when it happens, it'll be quick. It'll be like lots of big transformatory things. It'll go. So right now, the Australian government they've banned smartphones for, I can't remember what the age barrier is, but basically children can't have smartphones anymore. And the research that they based this on was showing a direct linear relationship between smartphone use and anxiety in children. It's not, it's a causal relationship. So they've done it. And everyone else is going to be watching that. And then, there's going to be some results, and then things are going to start to change. Human beings need connection. We will prevail.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely thing to end on, I think. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a world where we're constantly sold to at every point, and even our children are at every point of a device in the hand, just to love yourself is an act of social defiance. We need children to love themselves, so they become adults that love themselves too. Totally. Okay, well, look, Nancy, this has been fantastic, and I knew it would be, and it was as real and sincere as I hoped it would be.
Thank you.
And yeah, so I'm going to stop and just handing to Ellie now, but thanking everyone for joining us, and hand to Ellie to sort of wrap us up, really, and take it from there. But just goodbye for me. Well, I'm on the screen, but just a gratitude from me anyway, and Ellie.
And to you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us, Nancy, and thank you, Atif. That was a really brilliant conversation to get to listen to. I want to go back to what you said about the personalization, standardization dichotomy. It's challenging because, what you've covered today is both that everyone is unique and that we need to anticipate that. So trying to fit the uniqueness in with the anticipatory welcome. I understand why organizations can struggle to conceptualize that and put it into practice. And what we discuss in our workshops for neurodiversity and disability inclusion, and what you promoted as well here, Nancy, is what we describe in those workshops as the theory of change around those things, and how you can standardize the processes that allow and make space for personalization. And I think many of us who are disabled or neurodiverse or both feel like we're taking the first steps. I don't think I know anyone who doesn't feel like they have at some point had to forge the path themselves. And usually that's just to access something basic, and I feel like lots of us are happy to do that work, or to see the results of that work. And it always fills me with hope, not resentment, to see others take those paths that we have forged. But it doesn't have to be that way. As you've both said today, making the adjustments the norm doesn't just mean accepting difference, but expecting difference and celebrating it. And we see that when we work with organizations that, for example, use Access Passport to onboard employees, to ensure that everyone has access to share what they need to thrive in the workplace. And normalize making a workplace that works for you, and kind of reaping the benefits of that on a colleague to colleague level, and a colleague to line manager level, and organization wide, and just making that space for that anticipatory welcome where everyone can then have those personal conversations too. So yeah, thank you both for sharing so much today, and then for those of you in the chat who contributed too. We're really grateful to everyone for taking on this space so sincerely. And remember to think about what keeps you hopeful. You can continue that conversation by sharing on our social media, using the hashtag Labels and Legacies. We want these conversations to end in that space of hope, and I think Nancy, you've really helped us get there today. So thank you both so much again, and thank you to everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Goodbye.